No, he didn't invent Christianity. It's quite possible that he had a wife when he was younger. Was Jesus a very naughty boy?
He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy! Now go away!
Hello, my name's Helen Bond and I'm Professor of Christian Origins at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also co-host of the podcast Biblical Time Machine. And I'm here today to answer, or to try to answer, the most often Googled questions about Jesus. So here we go. Was Jesus called Jesus? Yes, he was probably called Yeshua, which is the Aramaic version of Jesus. It just means God saves, and was quite a popular name at the time. Jesus is the Greek version. Was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Now, this is a little bit more complicated because certainly Matthew and Luke want you to think that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. This is the town of David. And so there's clearly legends and stories that Jesus was born there. But the difficulty is that the stories that we have in Matthew and Luke's gospel, the only birth stories we have, date from the late 1st century. So that's quite a long time after Jesus was actually born. It might go back to genuine recollection, but it might also be that Jesus was just born in Nazareth, and then these stories developed later, deliberately trying to link him to Bethlehem, the city of David, because people want to say that Jesus is the second David. Was Jesus real? What archaeological evidence is there for him? Well, the first bit, was Jesus real? Yes, I think there's good reasons to think that Jesus was real. Certainly his followers start to talk about him within a couple of decades of his death. There's not any archaeological evidence for him, but then who would have archaeological evidence? You know, what would be left of any of us after 2,000 years? Jesus is an artisan, he's a builder or a carpenter. He's not going to leave any evidence in the archaeological world. So I don't think we should be too worried that we don't have archaeological evidence. And I don't think we should be too worried that Romans only start to talk about him a lot later either. The more important thing is that followers do start to talk about him. Paul writes about him in his letters within a couple of decades. So I think there's a good chance that Jesus was real. What records are there of Jesus? Well, okay, there's actually a lot of records. So the earliest ones are the letters of Paul. They date to the late 40s, early 50s. So that's very close to the date of the crucifixion. Paul doesn't tell us a great deal about Jesus, but he tells us about his death and resurrection. He says he had followers. He mentions certain sayings of Jesus, things like that. Probably the most comprehensive accounts of Jesus are in the Gospels, and there's 4 Gospels in the Bible, in the New Testament. There's also a huge number of Gospels outside the New Testament, ones that didn't get into the New Testament, and some of these are from maybe the 2nd century and beyond. So the earliest records then are Paul's letters and the Gospels. How popular was Jesus? This is an interesting one, actually, because the Gospels give the impression that everybody followed him. Loads of people, crowds, couldn't get enough of him. And that was probably right on one level. Jesus is this popular healer and prophet. So probably people are coming out and they're wanting to be healed and they're wanting to hear what he's saying. But, clearly he was executed in the end. He was very unpopular with a group of people in Jerusalem. And I imagine that they weren't the only ones who saw Jesus as something of a threat and perhaps were a bit worried by him. So I think in general terms, Jesus had a high degree of popularity amongst the ordinary people, but probably the higher up the echelons of society you went, the more worried people were by him. Was he crucified? I think this is probably the one we can say 100% yes to. It seems a very odd story for the early Christians to make up. If Jesus wasn't crucified, why on earth would you say that? And we know that one of the difficulties that early Christians had was in getting people to join the new movement when they said, well, he has great teaching, but it's a bit awkward that he was crucified by the Romans and they have to sort of explain that away. I think there's very good chance that that's 100% true. What languages did he speak? This is an interesting one too. So I think his native language would have been Aramaic. That's what people in the whole of this sort of eastern region spoke. That was their native language. It's not impossible that he had a few words of Greek, because Greek was the sort of the language that united everyone, that sort of the posh people spoke, and it was the language that you could use with travelers and traders. And so if he's a carpenter or a builder, or we don't quite know exactly what it is he did, but it might be that he speaks a few words of Greek in order to sort of, get by in his trade. What clothes did he wear? Yes, again, this is an interesting one, because the impression you have from one of these Jesus films is that he's sort of wearing the Bedouin outfit. He's got long hair, he's got these robes, maybe an outer robe. They're sort of flowing garments going right down to the ground. He's got sandals on his feet. Some of that might be true, but it does seem that people of his sort of class would have had much shorter tunics. Basically, people in Judea are wearing whatever anybody else is wearing in the Roman Empire at this time. And so some people might have worn togas, but probably someone like Jesus would have had a shorter tunic, maybe to his waist, maybe with a belt, possibly some kind of cloak over it. He would have worn sandals, but also there's evidence that people wore little sort of sock things to keep their feet warm, which I think is very sweet. So the whole sandals and socks, the Jesus look, is actually genuine. I'm always wondering about underwear too, and probably he would have had some kind of loincloth or undergarment like that, particularly if his tunic was quite short. Unfortunately, and this is a bit nasty, but most people at the time had lice, particularly if you only had one set of clothes. And clothes were extremely expensive and were made at home for most people. You didn't go out to the market unless you were very rich. So he may not have had that many changes of clothes, and probably like most people of his day, he had lice on his head and his body. And he probably would have had quite short hair. At the time, everybody was wanting to look like the emperor. The Emperor Augustus, of course, had a short haircut and no beard. It might have been different when Jesus was walking around and, on the road with people. Maybe he didn't have much of a chance to get his hair done and to have a shave. But his ordinary look, I think, would probably have been short hair rather than that look that we normally have. And of course, very dark hair and skin. Who were his parents? The Gospels, Matthew and Luke, say that his parents were called Mary and Joseph. And in the absence of any other ideas there, I suppose that may well be true. Mary was an extremely common name. Almost a third of women in the first century were called Mary. Joseph is also common, so they may well have been called Mary and Joseph. Did he do miracles? Well, this is an interesting one. Certainly people thought that he was doing miracles. And when opponents write about Jesus or come and speak to him to his face, the interesting thing is that they never say, "What are you talking about? You're not making any difference to these blind people or these lame people." What they argue is that he's channeling some sort of satanic power rather than doing it through the power of God. And also, you need to think about this sort of first century context. Jesus is not the only one to be able to do miracles. There are holy men in the Jewish tradition who are said to be able to do miracles, who can make the rain come, or who can heal people. There are people in the Old Testament, Elijah, Elisha, people like that who can work miracles. In the Greek and Roman world, too, there are people who have these powers. And of course, the god Asclepius is believed to be able to heal people. So this is a world where it's believed that people can heal and people can receive healing. So Jesus is part of this sort of this general landscape. So I think you either believe all of them or you believe none of them. But certainly people thought, and Jesus got a reputation as a great healer. Was he born in a barn? Well, According to Luke's gospel, he was born in a stable, or, there's a discussion as to how you translate that. Is it part of a sort of a homestead where the part where the animals are? There's also a later tradition that Jesus was born in a cave. The honest answer is we just don't know. It depends how much you trust these birth stories, which are sort of picture language. They're trying to build up a picture of Jesus and to say that he's the promised Messiah. He's the King David II. Maybe he was born in a barn, but we don't really know. What ethnicity was Jesus? Well, we know for sure that he was Jewish, completely Jewish. His parents were Jewish. He would have gone to synagogue. His whole thought world is Jewish. So, I don't think there's any doubt about that one. Why did the Romans want to kill him? This is right at the end of Jesus's life, of course. Part of the difficulty here is that he's come to Passover to Jerusalem, and the city is absolutely full of people celebrating the feast. They're drinking, they're having time off work, which they don't normally do in this kind of society. And he's sort of giving people this story about the coming kingdom of God, and people are getting very excited by this. And the one thing that the Roman governor needs to make sure is that there's not any kind of a riot or an uprising, particularly at a time like Passover. So it's a very volatile, difficult time of the year. And I think as much as anything, Pilate wanted to get rid of him because he was a threat to law and order. There's a chance he might cause a riot. He's got followers. They've come with him from Galilee. He's doing things in the temple. He's overturning the tables of the money changers. He's prophesying the temple's destruction. So probably better just to get rid of him and make sure that everything runs smoothly. Did he invent Christianity? This is a really interesting one. I would say the answer to that is no, he didn't invent Christianity. A lot of people think that Jesus was the first Christian, but that's not true at all. Jesus was Jewish, and throughout his entire life, he was a Jew. What he wanted to do was reform Judaism. He wanted to call people to repentance and to say, get yourself ready for the kingdom of God. God is about to break into human life and transform the world. And those 12 disciples he had are probably representatives of the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's very much a Jewish reform movement. I think nothing could be further away from Jesus's mind than creating a new religion that's named after him. It's much, much later. Some people say that Paul invented Christianity, but I would say it's even further beyond that. There's not even a word for Christianity at this period. It's much later, 2nd, 3rd century or so, when Christians and Jews clearly start to be different things, that you can actually talk about Christianity as something distinct from Jewish ways. Did Herod try to kill Jesus? Well, he might have done, and it depends which Herod you mean. One of the problems with the Herods is that there's lots of them, and they're all called Herod. At this period, it wasn't Herod the Great or Herod the First who was on the throne. It was his son Antipas, and he was the tetrarch or the ruler of Galilee, the area where Jesus grew up. We don't know for sure that Herod wanted to kill Jesus. In Luke's gospel, a FRSE goes to Jesus and says, beware of Herod because he's looking for you. But it makes a lot of sense that Herod Antipas might have been interested in Jesus because Herod has already killed John the Baptist, who was sort of Jesus's predecessor. So if Herod has killed him, Jesus might well have been a bit nervous that he didn't want to get too close to Herod Antipas. And that does sort of fit in with the record in the Gospels, because we never see Jesus going to any of the big cities where Herod sort of has his stronghold. He's always in the rural areas, the towns and villages and around the lake. So maybe he was keeping away from Herod. Did Pontius Pilate exist? Wow. Well, I've heard people say, did Jesus exist? But this is, yes, for sure, Pontius Pilate exists. Not only is he mentioned in the Gospels, but he's also mentioned in the Jewish historian Josephus, in both of his major works, the Jewish War and the Antiquities. And he actually tells us quite a lot about Pilate. He's also mentioned in a Jewish philosopher called Philo of Alexandria, and he was a very near contemporary of Pilate. He was writing around about AD 40, and Pilate was sent back to Rome around about 37, so very, very close there. There is some archaeological evidence connected with Pilate, but it doesn't specifically have his name on, apart from a ring that it's a very cheap and nasty ring, but it says Pilato on it. And one of the things that people think about this ring is that it was perhaps given to one of his administrators, and it's perhaps like his seal, his stamp. So I think, yes, definitely Pontius Pilate existed. Did he have disciples? Did Jesus have disciples, not Pontius Pilate? Yes. We all know about the 12 disciples, of course, who represent the renewed 12 tribes of Israel, and these are 12 men. But it seems to me that Jesus had a lot more than that. We learn about women who also walked around with him and were part of this inner group. And that makes a lot of sense, because if the disciples are going out spreading the message, the men can easily go and talk to other men, but men would have found it a lot harder to talk to women, to go into women's areas in houses, or to talk to women as they're cleaning by streams and things like that. So I think you would have needed quite a lot of female disciples as well, just to spread the message. So I think Jesus had lots of disciples, 12 in particular, but not only them. Did Jesus marry Mary Magdalene? Well, the thing is, we actually know nothing about Jesus' marital status. It's quite possible that he had a wife when he was younger. If so, I think he probably left her behind in Galilee, or maybe she died, and we just don't know. Certainly when Jesus starts on his ministry, I think it would be very unlikely that he's got a wife. He's telling people to get ready for the kingdom of God, which is going to break into people's lives very, very soon, and God is going to transform the world. That's not really the sort of talk you hear from someone who's got a wife. He's not really encouraging people to marry, have children, settle down. The whole sort of thrust of his message is, get ready because the world is going to end. That's not somebody who's getting married. And I know Mary Magdalene is often given that starring role as Jesus's wife.
Mary Magdalene was Jesus's wife.
The strange thing about Mary Magdalene is that she hardly appears in the Gospels. We do know that she's one of Jesus's followers, and along with other women. And in John's Gospel, she goes down to the empty tomb and she sees a vision of the resurrected Jesus. But there's absolutely nothing in that to give the impression that she's Jesus's wife.
Who is she?
My dear, that's Mary Magdalene.
The prostitute?
She was no such thing.
There's no impression either that she's a prostitute, which is the other job she's often associated with. All of that is a much later development. So I don't think there's any evidence that Jesus married Mary Magdalene. Was he a carpenter? Well, this is interesting. This translates a Greek word that can mean carpenter. It can also mean a stonemason or a builder. So it's something along those lines, some kind of skilled craftsman. My personal favourite, actually, is that he was a boat builder. And I think that's why he was so at home on the Sea of Galilee and why his first followers were all fisher folk. But that's a bit of a niche for you. Not many people think he was a boat builder. Where is his grave? Well, nobody knows. There is a grave in the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem. That was found in the early 4th century, and it's a 1st century grave, but we don't really know. It would be very unlikely that it's actually the grave of Jesus. It was found by Helen, the Emperor Constantine's mother. There's another alternative grave in Jerusalem too, the Garden Tomb. And that's been very popular since the 19th century, particularly with Protestants who don't like all the gold and everything that you get in the Holy Sepulchre. But this one definitely isn't his grave. It's a very old tomb. It's from the Iron Age and doesn't seem to fit what we know about Jesus's tomb from the Gospels. So the difficulty is we just really don't know. We don't even know whether it's true that he had this sort of mausoleum that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. I think it's quite a natural thing that the gospel writers and the early Christians want to imagine that Jesus had a nice, proper burial. But as far as we know, it could have actually just been quite a shallow tomb somewhere, the kind of burial that someone who's been executed is more likely to have had. At all events, it's quite interesting that we don't have any veneration of Jesus's grave. We don't hear of anything like that in the early church. What other religions does Jesus appear in? Well, this is not my special area, I have to say, but I know that he's actually quite a major character in the Quran, where he's a prophet there. He doesn't actually get crucified in the end. He seems to sort of dodge it somehow in the Quran. But so he is held in high esteem in that work. And I'm not sure that he's in any other religion besides that. Was Jesus a very naughty boy? Well, I think some people here have been listening to The Life of Brian.
Now you listen here. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. Now go away.
He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. In some ways, though, he actually was, or at least we have some infancy gospels, as they're called. Infancy Gospel of Thomas tells us all sorts of stories supposedly to do with Jesus's boyhood. So they're filling in that gap between Jesus's birth and the one story that we have about Jesus's boyhood in Luke's Gospel when he's age 12. Jesus is really, really naughty. He kills other children, and he's really rude to his teachers. In the end, nobody wants to teach him. And the townspeople in Nazareth ask Joseph and Mary to take him away. They say, because he's killing our children. And it's very difficult to know what to make of this text. Why is Jesus so naughty? The power of a God, but the mindset of a child. And maybe one of the things in this text is that he gradually sort of learns how to control his divine nature, so that the last story we see is Jesus in the temple with the teachers of the law. And by that stage, he's sort of learned to live with his divine nature. But if you want some stories about Jesus as a very naughty boy, then the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is the place to look. So that's the end of the questions, everything you ever wanted to know about Jesus. So I've been Helen Bond, and if you want to know more about biblical history, then go to my podcast, Biblical Time Machine. And if you want some excellent top historical stuff, go to History Hit YouTube channel.